Imagine a land flowing with milk and honey, a paradise for many, but also a land steeped in cruelty, injustice, and wickedness so dark that it would ultimately draw the direct judgment of God. This was the land of the Canaanites, a people whose story is intertwined with the earliest chapters of human history and the dramatic rise of Israel. Today, we'll dive deep into who the Canaanites were, their ancestry, culture, and why God brought judgment upon them. By the end, you'll see not only the story of ancient history, but also timeless lessons for our generation. So let's journey back thousands of years and explore the mystery of the Canaanites. The Canaanites were an ancient people inhabiting the land of Canaan, a region that roughly corresponds to modern-day Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, and parts of Syria and Jordan. According to the Bible, their ancestry traces back to Canaan, the grandson of Noah through Ham. This detail in Genesis is crucial because Ham's lineage, particularly through Canaan, is central to understanding why their land was so significant and why their moral corruption became a focus of God's judgment. Now, the Canaanites weren't just a single unified tribe. They were a collection of powerful city-states, each ruled by its own king and protected by massive fortified cities. They were incredibly skilled in agriculture, trade, and craftsmanship. Archaeological evidence points to advanced cities like Jericho and Hazor, which had impressive walls, sophisticated irrigation systems, and extensive trade networks that reached all the way across the Mediterranean. They weren't a primitive people by any means. They were a major power in the ancient world. The Canaanites were incredibly powerful and influential in the ancient Near East. Their cities were fortified with strong walls, they maintained formidable armies, and they dominated the critical trade routes connecting the mighty empires of Egypt and Mesopotamia. This strategic position brought them immense wealth and power, which allowed them to develop a complex culture. But unfortunately, it also enabled them to indulge in widespread moral corruption. Alongside their impressive material achievements, a deep spiritual darkness was growing. Their influence extended far beyond economics and politics. It touched every aspect of their religious and moral life, spreading a poison that would ultimately seal their fate. At the heart of Canaanite culture were their religious practices and their worship of a pantheon of gods. The most prominent among them were Baal, the god of storms and fertility, and his consort, Asherah. Their religious rituals were deeply entwined with pagan practices that the Bible repeatedly and forcefully condemns. Perhaps the most horrifying aspect of their worship was the practice of child sacrifice. Archaeological findings, particularly in sites related to Canaanite culture like Carthage and the neighboring Ammonite and Moabite regions, reveal chilling evidence of infants being sacrificed in religious ceremonies. The Bible describes this horrific practice in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, warning God's people in the strongest possible terms not to imitate such profound evil. Children, the most innocent and vulnerable among us, were offered up to these false gods, a practice that God viewed as the ultimate moral atrocity and an abomination. So, when the Israelites, led by Joshua, finally entered the land of Canaan after their 40 years in the wilderness, this is the culture they encountered. A people who were both materially powerful and spiritually corrupt. This was the land that had been promised to Abraham's descendants centuries earlier, but it was already inhabited by these powerful city-states. God instructed the Israelites to drive out the Canaanites. Now this command can be difficult for us to read today, but the Bible is clear that this was not an act of arbitrary cruelty or a land grab. It was a direct response to their ongoing and escalating evil. The Bible repeatedly highlights that the Canaanite sin had reached a tipping point. We're talking about systemic moral decay, the oppression of the weak and poor, rampant sexual immorality, and of course, the abomination of child sacrifice. Their judgment was a direct response to centuries of defiance against God's universal moral law. As Genesis 15:16 prophesied, the iniquity of the Amorites, another name for the Canaanites, was not yet complete, but by the time of Joshua, it had reached its fullness. The destruction of the Canaanites, most vividly depicted in the famous story of the conquest of Jericho, symbolized God's perfect holiness confronting humanity's deep-seated sin. In the book of Joshua, chapter 6, we read the dramatic account. For 6 days, The Israelites march around the city in silence, and on the seventh day they shout, the trumpets blast, and the walls come tumbling down. The city is conquered, and God's justice is executed. Following Jericho, other Canaanite cities fell one by one, reflecting both the Israelites' obedience to God's command and the inescapable consequences that await any society that becomes so steeped in evil. It is so important to understand that the Bible does not frame this as genocide for personal gain. It is presented as a divine judgment against a pervasive and irredeemable sin that had corrupted an entire culture. The Canaanite society had become so toxic that God's actions were a measure of both justice and a strange kind of mercy, a surgical removal of a cancer to preserve moral order for future generations and to protect his own people from being corrupted by these same practices. So, what does this ancient story mean for us today, thousands of years later? The story of the Canaanites is not just a dusty piece of history. It serves as a powerful mirror for all of humanity. It teaches us several crucial lessons. First, God sees sin and corruption. Evil, especially when it harms the vulnerable and the innocent, does not go unnoticed by a just and holy God. Second, idolatry and moral compromise have devastating consequences. Whenever we worship anything, whether it's money, power, success, or even ourselves, above God, or when we ignore His clear moral law, we invite corruption that can rot a society from the inside out. And third, justice may be delayed, but it is ultimately inevitable. God is incredibly patient, but His patience does not mean He is permissive. In the end, there is accountability for our actions, both as individuals and as societies. For our generation, the warning is crystal clear. We must not underestimate the danger of moral compromise, the poison of greed, or the tragedy of being apathetic toward the innocent and the helpless. God's call to us remains the same as it was to the prophet Micah, to live justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with our God. The story of the Canaanites is chilling, yes, but it's also a powerful call to vigilance, to justice, and to faithfulness in our own lives and in our own time. We must remember that God's standards of right and wrong are eternal, and His call to righteousness is for every single generation, including ours. If you found this journey into history and scripture enlightening, please give this video a like, share it with your friends, and be sure to subscribe to our channel. We have many more biblical deep dives coming your way, connecting ancient truths with the world we live in today. Thanks for watching.